Gas prices have come down substantially over the past few months, from over $5 per gallon to just under $4 per gallon. Now, of course, $4 per gallon is still significantly higher than where we were just a year ago, but it is nonetheless still progress from $5 per gallon.
The average gas price in New York State has hit the $5 per gallon mark. In New Jersey, it is now $5.03.
This has caused many to assume that supply chain issues have been resolving and that inflation has been cooling down. And while these factors definitely do play a role, one of the most blatant reasons for the recent decrease is oil stimulus from the US. You see, the US Department of Energy likes to keep a backup oil reserve called the US Strategic Petroleum Reserve. This reserve is meant for serious emergencies like the US getting into a war or the Middle East staging a strike. But since March of this year, the US has been using these reserves to alleviate gas prices. Whether this is a justifiable reason is debatable, but one thing that's for sure is that the US has been depleting these reserves fast. I could go through the specific numbers, and we will later on in the video, but I think just looking at this chart will tell you everything you need to know. So how much longer do we have until the US depletes their backup reserves? To estimate how much time we have left, the easiest thing to do would be to calculate the average rate of decline and use that to project into the future. If you zoom into the chart, you'll see that the cliff dive really started in April of 2022, when the reserves stood at 568 million barrels of oil. If we scroll to October, however, the reserves are estimated to stand at just 359 million barrels. That right there is not only a 40-year low in terms of reserves, but also a record pace of decline. During this 6-month period, the US would have used up 209 million barrels of reserve oil. That translates to an average of about 35 million barrels per month. At that rate, the reserves would only last for another 10 months, taking us to about August of next year. But if we look closer at the data, we'll see that we don't have nearly that much time. Here's the thing, not all crude oil is created equal, and the US doesn't just store one type of crude oil. They actually store two types called the medium sour and light sweet. To the naked eye, both of these would look the same, as the differences are mainly internal. Medium sour oil has a higher density and a higher sulfur content, which is what the world has become accustomed to. This is the type of oil that is pumped out by Russia, Venezuela, and much of the Middle East. And this is also the type of oil that the US refiners are used to as well. Given that refiners are currently the biggest bottleneck in the oil market, the US has leaned into their needs. In other words, the vast majority of oil the US has been unloading, as in 85%, is medium sour crude oil. This means that out of the 35 million barrels that they were offloading every month, roughly 30 million barrels were sour and 5 million were sweet. This wouldn't be that big of a problem if medium sour accounted for 85% of their reserves, but it doesn't. According to the government's website, 40% of the reserves were sweet and 60% were sour as of the beginning of 2022. If we assume that this ratio was more or less maintained until we saw the cliff dive in April, we started with roughly 340 million barrels of sour oil and 227 million barrels of sweet oil. At a rate of 30 million barrels of sour oil and 5 million barrels of sweet oil every month, we'll be left with approximately 160 million barrels of sour oil and 197 million barrels of sweet oil by October. If we don't change up our rate of consumption or ratio of consumption, the sour oil reserves will be gone by March. As for the sweet oil reserves, we'll still have plenty of that, but that probably wouldn't be all that helpful. Here's the thing, when you have a refining bottleneck with sweet oil, pumping up the supply won't actually lead to more final output. Also, it's unlikely that refiners will be willing to expand their light sweet operations all that much when this is just a temporary influx of sweet oil. So the countdown has already started, and it's just a matter of months until the US will have to pull the plug. Now, you might be thinking that this was a nice thing for the government to do. They finally stepped up and took action against oil prices that were spiraling out of control. While this could be their reasoning, it's probably not the case. You see, the US never taps into this oil reserve. Looking at this graph, you can see that the reserves are always stagnating or going up. This is literally the first time the US has been depleting SPR reserves since it was created way back in 1975. They didn't even deplete the reserves in 2008 when the US saw a massive recession and oil prices hit over $180 per barrel. So clearly, they're more desperate than ever before. And why are they more desperate than ever before? Well, it's because inflation is way out of control and it's making the incumbent politicians look incompetent right before the midterm elections. And that right there is the key to everything they've been doing. Obviously, there's nothing that politicians can do to bring down inflation to 3% or solve the supply shortage within the next 2 months. But something they can do is deplete the emergency oil reserves to create the impression that inflation is coming down. Here's the thing, the average person doesn't actually follow CPI readings on a monthly basis. Their gauge of inflation is simply based on how much their daily and monthly expenses are. If they suddenly go to the pump one day and their bill is $10 lower than usual, they're gonna assume that inflation is getting better. And it's not just the pump that they'll see this difference either. When you bring down oil prices, you bring down prices across the board because almost all everyday goods rely on transportation. Take milk for example. Milk is still super expensive on a historical basis, but prices have stopped going up since May. We don't know how much of this is actually due to oil prices coming down, but one thing's for sure, they're definitely trying. The only problem though is that all the signs point to them stopping trying right after the election is over. Take the oil depletion for example. If the rate of depletion was 15 or 20 million barrels of oil per month, we could come to the conclusion that maybe it's more of a long-term plan. This rate would actually be sustainable for a few years, which might be enough time for oil prices to naturally cool down. But with a depletion rate of 35 million barrels per month and sour oil reserves being projected to run out by Q2 of next year, it's hard to believe that this is anything but a short-term political play. It seems like they want to bring down oil prices as much as possible before the election. But after the election, it doesn't seem like they'll care all that much. Even if they did care, it's not like they could do anything about it given that the oil reserves would already be nearly depleted. So in my opinion, I think it's highly likely that they Rugpull us shortly after the election, but I'll let you be the judge of that. Whether this is all just one big political move or not, in the end, it doesn't really matter. Either way, we end up in the same destination, which is depleted emergency oil reserves. So, what happens next? Well, fortunately for us, the US Department of Treasury has done some studies regarding how the emergency reserves are affecting gas prices. To accomplish this, they looked at data regarding the stock of oil and the flow of oil. Now, of course, no model is perfect, and that applies to the US Treasury as well. For example, in their calculations, they assumed that there is zero elasticity on the supply side. Similarly, they also assumed that logistical and technical issues can be ignored. Given how bad the supply chain has been over the past 2 years, these assumptions are obviously not super realistic, but it's the best that we've got. According to the study, the release of American oil reserves has resulted in a price reduction of 33 cents per gallon. Something that we should note is that it wasn't just the US that was depleting their oil reserves. When President Biden announced his plans to leverage American reserves, he also got partners in the IEA or the International Energy Agency to play along. Together, it's estimated that they've brought down oil prices by approximately 38 cents per gallon. So, simple logic tells us that when these organizations stop injecting oil into the system, gas prices should go up by 38 cents. But it's obviously not that simple. If oil prices naturally cool down by this point, then maybe we can see oil prices continue to trend down even after these guys withdraw their support. This would be the most ideal situation, and hopefully it's what happens. If oil prices are still at relatively high levels, however, we could easily see oil prices spike by much more than 38 cents because we would no longer have a safety net. Oil suppliers will be well aware that the US can't pull off this stunt again, so they might have even more pricing power than they had before this fiasco. The country that America would really have to worry about is not Saudi Arabia or some other Middle Eastern country. They would actually have to worry about Canada. Most people don't know this, but Canada is actually America's #1 source of imported oil. Literally 62% of US crude oil imports comes from Canada, so they have quite a bit of power. Fortunately, the US and Canada are pretty good allies, so it's extremely unlikely that Canada would do anything to destroy America. For example, they're not gonna stop oil exports altogether and watch as gas prices shoot up to $30 per gallon in America. But just because they won't do something so drastic, it does not mean that they'll be gracious with the pricing, especially when you consider that America has never been gracious with Canada. You see, Canada actually has the third largest oil reserves in the entire world, but they've never really been able to leverage this to become a global player. If you're interested in why, I have a full video about Canada's oil situation. But long story short, Canada has basically been forced into a situation where 99% of their oil ends up in the North American market, or basically just America. And this has given the US the opportunity to essentially blackmail Canada into giving them cheap oil. The argument from the US is usually, we have these massive reserves as well as sources from Russia and the Middle East, so we don't need you, you need us. So if you want us to buy your oil, give us a discount. And that's exactly what Canada's been doing, with the average discount on Canadian oil being $20 per barrel. But now, the tables have turned. The emergency reserves are rapidly depleting, and Russia is out of the equation, so Canada has the upper hand. And honestly, after getting taken advantage of for so many decades, I think it's only fair that Canada gets to turn the script on the US. But let's just say it won't be very fun for our pocketbooks. In the end, if you've been wondering why gas prices have been plummeting over the past few months, it's not because inflation is coming down. It's actually because the government has essentially been handing out gas stimulus from their emergency reserves. At the current rate, however, they won't be able to sustain the stimulus for much longer. But honestly, that seems to have been their plan all along. Cool down gas prices before the election as much as possible, and we'll worry about the rest later. In the medium term, this may end up giving Canada more pricing power than ever, allowing them to finally have some time in the spotlight at the expense of everyday Americans. Again, I wouldn't blame Canada for this, but rather American politicians for putting America in such a situation. But that's just what I think. Do you think it was justified to leverage the emergency oil reserves? Comment that down below. Also, drop a like if you wish politicians didn't just care about elections. And of course, consider checking out our Discord community to suggest future video ideas, and to consider subscribing to see more questions logically answered. But until then, I'm Hari, and I'll see you guys on the next one.